This edition of Farming the Countryside is brought to you by Corteva Agriscience Range and Pasture. Your land, your herd, our commitment. Learn more at rangeandpasture.com/countryside. Here's a look at some of the work we've been doing with Corteva Pasture and Range on our farm.
Well, spring of 2026 here, I think our plan is look at the ultigraze in a couple of places where we need to do that just because we need the fertility, but we also need the weed control in some hard to get to places. But then we'll prioritize pastures that didn't get treated with NovaGraze or Adoracor last year, just knowing those will probably be problem spots. Evaluate what we did use NovaGraze with last year and see if we have enough annual Espadiza that helps with weed control, or if we need to go in and spray there again to help continue to promote that Espadiza and hopefully even some white clover.
White clover is really nice to introduce into these cool season grass pastures. It is very tolerant to lower soil pHs, to poor fertility, and so they're a little more forgiving than a lot of other legumes. But having white clover in there also is going to help you out with your nutritional needs for your cattle.
To see more from our farm and others, just go to rangeandpasture.com/countryside.
Hi, I'm Andrew McCrae. Welcome to our farm and ranch in northwest Missouri. My great-great-grandfather settled here in 1910, and I'm the fifth generation to grow crops and livestock here. As a farmer myself, I know the highs and lows of this life, the issues we confront every day, some new, some as old as farming itself. This show is a place to talk with farmers and others in the ag industry about topics that mean something to us, topics that can improve the present and future of our operations. This is Farming the Countryside. Ray Starling is my guest here on Farming the Countryside. Always good to visit with Ray in North Carolina. And Ray, for those that have forgotten, tell folks a little bit about what you do. You're with the Chamber of Commerce, which on the surface may not sound like that's much to do with ag, but in a lot of ways you have everything to do with ag.
Yeah, no, I think one thing we say here at the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce is we don't think of, like many agriculturalists will think of, the chamber and the business community working together with the agriculture or agribusiness community. We like to point out there's no difference there. The agriculture community is the business community. And at least since 2019, when I got here to the statewide chamber, we have really tried to focus on agriculture and agribusiness and be an advocate for that vertical, if you will, in our state's economy, just like we are for manufacturers or the healthcare industry or any others. So I feel blessed to be here because I think it gives me a broader platform and certainly has educated me on issues outside of the agricultural spectrum. But you'd be surprised how many of the issues are really the same. So yeah, I work at a statewide chamber. My background for most of my career has been in agricultural policy work, and I do dabble in other things as well, but mostly trying to help set good policy that helps our industry continue to thrive.
Well, whenever I have you on here, we're usually talking about things that maybe have a legal aspect to them, policy aspect. And, I follow some of your writings, of course, and what you're posting. And there's been a lot of talk recently about H2A and a lot of the things that are changing. And I guess on the surface, it would be tempting for some farmers to say, well, that doesn't impact me because I don't have an H2A worker. I'm betting you're going to say, well, maybe you don't think it does, but this is something that is impacting all of agriculture. Maybe I should just give you kind of free rein here to talk about, okay, where have we been and where are we moving to based on some of the most recent rulings that we've had?
Yeah, well, let me take that first point you made, Andrew, because I actually agree with you that I think there are probably farmers that are able to do out where you live and maybe up through the Dakotas, the larger Midwest. If you are a grain farmer and you are mostly doing corn, wheat, things of that nature, you probably can, in the back of your mind, say, I don't have a high dependence on H2A. But what we are finding is that as the domestic workforce for agriculture becomes more and more difficult to find and to retain competitively, folks who have not traditionally thought about accessing the H2A program are consistently reaching into that program to find and meet their labor needs. And so I would just say that the program has frankly grown in importance in the United States. In fact, I think I have some numbers here in front of me that back in 2021, we were bringing into the country on a temporary vetted seasonal basis, in the low 300,000s of workers. So, in an entire calendar year, there were about 315 to 317,000 H-2A workers that came in the country to do temporary work back in 2021. In 2025, that number was 400,000, which of course is an increase of about 85,000 workers. And we believe we are on track in 2026 to even eclipse that number, to go well over 400,000. And the way this works is, if you want an H-2A worker, if you believe you have the need in your community to bring in a worker from outside the United States to work on your farm, there are a lot of protections in the program for domestic workers. In other words, the lawmakers that authorized this program did not want farmers to just displace American workers and hire what some may perceive to be less expensive foreign workers in their place. And so there's a lot of protections for the domestic workforce inside the program, one of which is you cannot become certified to actually continue through the process to get an H-2A worker unless you have advertised the position that you have to the community of domestic workers. And it's only after you can have done that and you can say with integrity, I was unable to find local workers, then the Department of Labor, and it's actually, of course, it's like many things in the federal government, if you can't fix a problem, make it more complex. I mean, it actually involves Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, in terms of getting workers in and out and getting the temporary visas and things of that nature. Of course, DHS's role is to vet the security behind them and make sure they're not a threat in any way or another. And that has basically always been true, that H-2A workers pose very, very, very little threat in terms of compliance and legality once they're in the United States. But several hoops you have to jump through, again, to make sure you're not depressing the wages or depressing the opportunities of the domestic worker. And so in addition to having to certify that you've searched for the worker domestically before resorting to the foreign guest worker, one of the things the federal government says is there's a minimum wage that you have to pay these workers. And that's what some of this more recent litigation has really been about.
Yeah, so the H-2A workers, North Carolina, is there certain industries where you're seeing more of those? Because you mentioned, now I know folks that maybe in the grain crops out here in the Midwest that do have some H-2A workers, but are we mostly talking swine, poultry, dairy? Where are we talking mostly in North Carolina there?
Yeah, well, our situation here, we actually have a pretty long history in North Carolina of using H-2A workers, because back in the 80s and 90s, again, as finding domestic workers to do seasonal labor in agriculture became more and more and increasingly difficult, we were heavily dependent in that time on tobacco. It was probably our biggest cash specialty crop. I mean, it really was. And it also, you could absorb the cost of the program in tobacco easier than perhaps you could in some of the other crops. And so because of North Carolina's long heritage in tobacco, we became very dependent on the H-2A program. And in fact, one of the nation's largest workforce placement agencies is the North Carolina Growers Association right here in our state. And so I did look at these numbers. In fiscal year 2025, North Carolina had 25,000 of those 400,000 workers. Now, if you go out to Missouri, you're going to see numbers like 2,500 as compared to 10,000 for us. So that does sort of show you the difference. But then you can go out to California. California has 35,000, got 35,000 positions certified. It makes sense that they would have a large number of workers given their produce sector out there and the fresh fruits and vegetables. But frankly, their numbers pale in comparison to Florida, which in 2025 got like 56,000 workers. So there's a lot of correlation between fresh fruits and vegetables, high value agricultural crops, and these workers, because frankly, they are expensive and you cannot afford to spread the cost very well unless you've got a high value crop, which fortunately, fruits and vegetables, you have maybe a little more to play with that. A lot of folks up in the apple, cherry, pear industry in the Pacific Northwest as well. So definitely these pockets around the country where you've got intense H-2A participation. But even in Maine, I was looking at this a few minutes before we got on the phone to talk. Maine in 2025 brought in 1,500 H-2A workers. Maine. I mean, you've been to Maine. I've been to Maine. It's like, you can drive across the state in a couple of hours. And so maybe that's not right. It's a beautiful state, by the way. You taught me about Acadia National Park in Maine, as a matter of fact, where you can see the sunrise earliest in the morning of any place in the United States. And I did that trip. And by the way, while we're off topic, my wife and I had to wake up at 3 a.m. twice because the first morning it was cloudy. So we got up the second morning, and I can now say I was one of the first people to see the sunrise in the United States on a certain day, but I don't even remember the day, and no one's ever actually acted impressed. So I don't know that I recommend that. Sleep in and just know you were in the place where the sun rose earliest. But for Maine to have 1,500 workers, I mean, that just shows you this program does have a national footprint. And frankly had grown to be, because of the adverse effect wage rate that's established by the Department of Labor, which is essentially the minimum wage in the H-2A program. It had just gotten more and more expensive to use, and frankly, farmers were basically saying, "Look, we're either going to have to shut down here, or we've got to find a more competitive place for labor." And the argument was not, we're just looking for cheap labor. The argument really was, we do not believe that the floor that the federal government is setting for the minimum wage here actually is accurate compared to what we're paying the little bit of domestic workforce that's involved in this work. And so resetting that adverse effect wage rate, the ag community, of course, was very happy to see that. I can talk about the mechanics of how they did it, but let's just say not everyone was pleased with the Trump administration's action on that. So we can unpack that too.
Well, that ruling, and we don't necessarily have to get deep into the weeds, but basically, what did that do then? What did that do to the wage?
Well, after the Trump administration last October released a new wage methodology rule, I mean, essentially reestablished or established in a different way how the adverse effect wage rate would be calculated. And again, I can talk about kind of what they did that was different, but at a pretty high level, they basically are using a different survey of folks working in ag than they had been using, which they frankly had to do, because my sense was that USDA had announced it was no longer going to conduct the survey that it was using. And so DOL said, we got to find data from somewhere else. They can get that data from their own Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's what they said in the rule they would start doing. And then they created just two classes of workers in the H-2A program, two different skill levels, if you will, with most of the H-2A community that's coming into the country fitting in the skill one, the less expensive per hour skill level. And so those were two really big changes. And then a third one, I guess, was you have to participate in the program, you have to offer housing to the H-2A worker, which makes sense to me. Like, I don't think that's a bad part of the federal rule, because these workers that are coming in, again, on a temporary basis, they need safe and wholesome sort of shelter to be ready to work and to stay healthy throughout the year. And so in almost every case, the farmer procures that housing for the H-2A worker, which of course is a cost to the farmer. And so one of the things I think the new Trump administration rule does that previously had not been done in the H-2A program was it gives you a credit for the cost of that housing. And that credit is basically used to offset part of the wage you would otherwise pay the worker. Not unlike, you get certain benefits through your employer, and should your employer quit providing those benefits, you as an employee would say, well, if you're going to take away my health insurance, you're going to have to pay me a few more $100 or maybe even $1,000 or more a month so that I can go afford to pay my own health insurance. Well, the American farmers weren't necessarily providing housing to the domestic worker, but they were providing it to the guest worker, the H-2A worker. And so the US DOL saw that as an unfairness toward the American worker and said, if you're providing housing to that H-2A worker, we're going to let you deduct part of the cost of that housing against, or use it as a credit against, the H-2A wage rate. So as you might imagine, this ultimately resulted in the wage rate for farm workers that are in the H-2A program In many cases, it was projected then to go down. And so an entity called the Union of, I think it's UFW, Union of Farm Workers, actually sued in federal court out in California to say, hey, we think this rule violates the Administrative Procedures Act and is arbitrary and capricious, and it should be enjoined. So they went to a California federal courts and asked the court to basically enjoin the rule.
You would say, though, that this ruling has been, I guess, pro-agriculture as far as allowing more H-2A workers or more farms to have better access at a more reasonable rate. Is that what you would say?
I would say that, and I would add to that, though, I think folks have to keep in mind, it is either this or nothing, right? Like, it is either access this guest worker program, or you don't grow the things that need hand-intensive assistance. And there was one of the things we hear that kind of drives us crazy in the agricultural space is you just need to pay domestic workers more, and you'll have all the domestic workers you would hopefully want to use. And I mean, I believe in supply and demand. I believe in higher wage cost, attracting people into an industry. But in reality, what we've seen in rural US, where many of these crops are grown, is that observation is frankly not true. That regardless of well, it's really not true for two reasons. I mean, there were many parts of the country that are already paying $15, $16, $17, $18 an hour for guest workers. They had to offer the domestic worker that same amount. And so at the end of the day, we still weren't attracting the domestic worker through our recruitment efforts. So that just patently was not true. And then second, we cannot pass. I mean, someone would say in response to that, well, then why don't you pay them $32 an hour? Surely you would attract a domestic worker at $32 an hour. Well, you would, but you would go out of business, because there's also this little thing called profitability. And particularly in the fresh fruits and vegetables space, we've got competition just on the other side of the border where we're paying $15, $16 an hour. I mean, there are clearly places in Mexico where that would not really be unheard of to be a wage for an entire day. And so our products are expected to compete with those when the labor costs were literally a fraction of our own here. And so again, I'm doing a lot of background here, Andrew, but I feel like the program has to be defended, and people that don't understand it have to know, no, you can't just snap your fingers and go find someone that's willing to do very difficult and skilled work in very tough circumstances, outside in the heat, in the humidity, if you're in North Carolina or Florida or some of the southern states, and only do it for a certain period of time, right? I mean, part of the another protection here is you cannot hire an H-2A worker for an entire year at the time. About 10 months is about the most you can do at a time. And even for 10 months, more than likely that farm worker is moving from crop to crop within a farm, or even moving from employer to employer while they're in town on a single work visa. So again, lots of details we could get in, but we had a good day in the federal court because the federal court basically looked at the Union of Farm Workers and said, sympathetic to your arguments, understand them, certainly know you have a role to play in this conversation, and we do too. It's not always an adversarial situation between farmers and H-2A workers and those that represent them. At the end of the day, we all want a reliable workforce in agriculture and understand that's important to our national security. But with that said, the court essentially said, you have not shown enough evidence here of the standard. You've not met the standard of irreparable harm that the court needs to step in halfway through, or at least a third of the way through the growing season, and blow up the Trump administration's rule. And I think, frankly, part of the court's challenge around that was, what would you do in its place? I mean, the court would literally have to fashion a made-up remedy to set wages a third of the way into the season, after contracts have been signed and workers have come into the United States. Maybe one more thing that happened, the rule gets established last October. The Union of Farm Workers filed not much longer after that, a few weeks, they filed their lawsuit, but they waited till basically Christmas to actually file for the preliminary injunction saying, stop this for 2026. And I think the court was really troubled that if the rule had been, the rule was adopted basically in October, you should have been in here before even October was out. asking that we take a look at this. And the fact that you didn't do that shows us maybe this irreparable immediate harm is not as irreparable and immediate as we thought it was. So the case will continue. There's certainly going to be more discussion on the merits of the case, but the idea that the program will be blown up halfway through the year is at least we put that risk to the side for the moment.
And Ray, the time we've got remaining here, let's hit on a few topics quickly. Last time you were on, we were awaiting a Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, which impacts more than agriculture, but certainly we're talking from an agriculture point of view right now. What do we know and what do we not know? Because in a sense, they ruled against the Trump administration, but then the administration says, well, we're we're going to go after this a different way. So where do we stand now on some of these tariffs?
Yeah, well, I would just say I don't remember what I said during our previous conversation, but I know when I've been asked about this issue before on panels and things, I've said, the Trump administration was already planning what other tools did it have in its tools chest to keep some tariffs in place. And I think you see what now we're in kind of this quiet period where the Department of Commerce is taking comment and doing its own investigation about whether it can use some of its other tariff setting rules. So all that to say, yes, I mean, this was absolutely a groundbreaking, consequential case. I think the analogy or the metaphor you and I probably used was what the USTR had said over and over, and he is actually a friend of mine. I appreciate his public service. Jameson Greer had said over and over, look, if the government has the authority, if the president has the authority to completely stop the inflow of a product from another country, certainly the president has the authority to levy a tariff that would merely increase the cost of that product coming into the United States. Basically, the Supreme Court said, no, we actually don't agree with that argument. And someone else said, I wish I could take credit for this, and I don't necessarily think it's what the court said, but in another metaphor that answers, I think, Jameson's metaphor well, it said, think of it like this. The firemen in your local community have the authority to block off a road with a fire truck and say, you are not allowed to travel on this road because, there's some dangerous activity down the road. But if a fire truck pulled halfway into the road and came out with a little bucket and said, you can only travel down this road if you pay me some money. Otherwise, there's a risk down there that I'm going to keep you from being exposed to. That would be a different, that sort of turned the light on that, like, well, yeah, I can certainly see this issue two ways metaphorically. But the two sort of takeaways from that are, number one, there's still other authority under federal law that the president is exploring using, and I suspect ultimately will. And number two, the lack of predictability and certainty on this is still creating the sort of market turmoil that makes it tough to make decisions about pricing and about what your inputs are actually going to cost. And so I wish there was something more certain there, more durable, clearly in a time when so many things in the agriculture sector are volatile in terms of cost. But no silver bullet. I think we're going to be having this tariff debate as long as we have the current leadership in the administration.
Well, and on the policy side, then, because of all that uncertainty, does USDA and the government continue then to make payments to farmers to try to help them through this time? I mean, we're talking about obviously higher input costs and for the most part not higher crop prices. So what happens?
Yeah, I think that's a great point and gives me the opportunity to segue into something a little bigger. As you point out, I think this could possibly be the third year in a row that our production costs in the United States are actually lower than what we get when we sell, in particular, corn and beans, but probably wheat too, at the per bushel price that's, whatever's available on average. And so clearly that government intervention has been important to keeping folks on their feet. What I would say about that is, yes, I think some of the temporary tension there around tariffs, around input cost, to be honest, which may or may not be predicated on the tariffs. I mean, the access to fuel, the access to pesticides, the access to fertilizer, the access to labor, like we were just talking about. I mean, all those things have created that squeeze in terms of input costs. But I think there's a deeper question we've got to ask ourselves in agriculture, and that is, are we actually going to be able to continue to be? And I think we know the answer to this question. That's what makes it hard. Are we going to be the world's low-cost producer, particularly for corn and soybeans? I mean, what's happening in South America is basically we are getting beat. And there are in South America, there are lots of government subsidies to that industry. Some of them are direct. Some of them are very indirect in terms of the way some of those South American countries have actually invested in the infrastructure that they need to get product out from places like Mato Grosso out to the ports and into the water so that it can be the low-cost producer. And so I just sort of ask us all to pause a minute and say, and I'm no fan of the critics of the U.S. food system. I mean, my book is literally about pointing back to those people that say the food system is broken and saying, no, it's not. It's actually incredible. It's amazing. Look at what it's done since World War II and even before, quite frankly. But I think we are going to have to ask ourselves a hard question about, are we producing too much of things that the world is not going to always take off our hands like it has done really the last 25 or 30 years. That's why me and others, and I would invite you and folks listening in to be involved in the work that we're doing for the Center for American Food Power, which is really looking at that hard question. Are we actually growing the things here that we can consume here and want to consume here? And Exhibit A in that, Andrew, is if you look at our imports of agricultural products, they continue to rise. And so while we're a net exporter, or have been for most of the last 10 years, it's gotten awfully close in a few of the more recent years. And there's even been an ag deficit, if you will, for a few of those years. But as we look at those numbers, it's pretty clear that while we like to claim we feed ourselves and we feed the world, we are importing a lot of agricultural products that probably ought to force us to step back and say, wow, maybe we need to think about how we produce some of the things that we're so dependent upon imports on and concentrate less on some of the major commodities. I know that's heresy. I know that's tough talk. You might get some hate mail about that. I don't know. But all I'm asking is, I'm not saying we definitely got to do it a certain way. I'm just saying, man, it sure seems to me like we ought to at least start the conversation.
Ray, to wind up, tell folks where they find not only your work, the book, but you also mentioned some of the other groups that you're a part of, and folks might be interested in that.
Yeah, well, obviously, Center for American Food Power, you can Google that. The book is Farmers versus Foodies. It's available on Amazon. Andrew, you've sold multiples of books that I will ever dream of selling. And what I like to say about Farmers versus Foodies is it's sold dozens and dozens of copies around the world. But I do speak in connection with the book. And I think really one of the things I like to do is try to translate the cultural moment that we're in. What is happening why are we having this, some of these harder discussions in agriculture, not just because of the economics, but what's happening elsewhere in the culture. And so I write about that. If you want to be a part of that, you can just look us up at the NC Chamber and get on our Ag Allies mailing list. Andrew's actually been a speaker at our Ag Allies conference in the past. And so lots of ways to follow my babble if you're interested.
Ray, always good to visit.
My pleasure, Andrew. Appreciate what you do out there.
This edition of Farming the Countryside has been brought to you by Corteva Agriscience Range and Pasture. Your land, your herd, our commitment. Learn more at rangeandpasture.com/countryside.